My name's Marvin Rosenau, and I'm an instructor at BCIT in the Fish, Wildlife and Recreation program. And I teach in a number of other programs as well at BCIT in the Natural Resources Group, Ecological Restoration. I supervise students on certain projects in the engineering group, environmental engineering. So I have sort of a broad-based that's my real job.
Right.
I also do other side contracts. I worked for two First Nations groups up on the Nechako as an expert witness for Sturgeon in a Rio Tinto court case for flows. So that was a major issue that I worked on. I've worked on other court cases. I've worked with, in terms of First Nations, I've worked with Casey First Nations on Alouette flows. I've done a lot of stewardship work, voluntary stewardship stuff, too much really, spending a lot of my time getting no pay for it. But that's okay. That's sort of my passion, sort of my interest. So I guess you could call it my hobby. But my main job right now is BCIT in the Fish, Wildlife and Recreation program.
That is really interesting to hear. When did this become an interest of yours? When did supporting wildlife habitats, making sure that fish are studied and understood, when did this become something that you were passionate about?
Well, that's really hard to say, I think, because it goes back to kind of something at a very young age, a core age, I think that comes to us and just all of a sudden expresses itself. And you don't know why a pianist, concert pianist becomes a concert pianist, or a football player becomes a football player, or a lawyer, whatever. I think it was because I grew up in the eastern Fraser Valley in the Chilliwack area. So I was born and raised in Chilliwack in my earlier years and then moved into Metro Vancouver. But at a very early age, 4 or 5 years of age, we moved out onto a farm on Banford Road in East Chilliwack, south of what's now the number 1 highway. They were just building it. And at that point, it was still, it had only been 30 or 40 years since that whole area had been drained. It was a vast sort of wetland. So Prairie Central, the name Prairie Central is road there. And so it was a wet area. The horses, in fact, had snowshoes kind of arrangements. The mud was so thick. And so there were still lots of little ponds and wetlands and streams and whatnot that had not been completely obliterated. And so things like frogs and ducks and crows and sticklebacks in the stream, leeches, the cutthroat trout, baby coho salmon, these were all part of my growing up. And so my father wasn't really an angler. He wasn't really a hunter, wasn't really an outdoors person, but you were sort of overwhelmed with the outdoor sort of ambience, I guess.
Right. That seems to have some key elements to it, right? Those type of environments, those type of ecosystems are really important, and we're just starting to kind of get that now.
That's correct. And I think, it was just a marvelous, Chilliwack right now sort of distresses me to come and see it because it is just, this urban, suburban, oppressive, all the little groves of trees and culverted ditches that no longer are extant, changes to the landscape. It's a very kind of a soft, easy growing up atmosphere. And, we walked to school. There were no sort of strange people around, no predators, no bad people, it seemed, as a child. And that was a very naive way of looking at it. But it was also a very conservative background, very conservative upbringing, as most people in the Eastern Fraser Valley know. So it wasn't until we moved. My dad became a teacher. He worked at the ubiquitous Fraserville Frosted Foods, which every kid in the valley in those days worked at as a summer job. As a mechanic, became a teacher, and we moved to Coquitlam, where he taught in Burnaby North.
Right. Interesting. How do you feel about the changes that are taking place? Maybe let's go back a little bit. The Vetter River didn't always exist. It used to flow as the Chilliwack River, and was that a net positive? It was a huge change, and it seems fascinating to sort of look back on.
Well, I actually wrote a report for the Pacific Fisheries Resource Conservation Council on agriculture and impacts to fish and fisheries in the eastern Fraser Valley. That was during a little politically implemented timeout, as the assistant deputy minister said, because I was a bad boy. I criticized some projects that the premier was tied to. And in any event, I reviewed a lot of the stuff. Where we are sitting right now, where we're having the interview, the Chilliwack River would have flowed through this room, okay? And so in the latter part of the 1800s, farmers were starting to settle eastern Fraser Valley. So the Vedder Crossing, Sardis area versus the Yarrow area, and the farmers were kind of battling back and forth. One group would push it to the south, and then the next group would push it to the north. So they were trying to develop these fields, and so what ended up happening is these myriad of channels, Luckakuk and Atchlet Slough, Chilliwack. These are tiny remnants of what have been this magical, just extraordinary fish ecosystem that called the Chilliwack River that flowed northward, just west of the Squaw and Squay reserves at the end of Wellington, and was pushed into Sumas Lake, and then the whole story. So Judge Holloway sided on the folks in the Sardis area to keep the river flowing more south into Vedder Creek, which is now the Vedder River.
How do you feel about that? Do you feel like that was a step in the right direction? Do you feel like we lost something due to that?
Oh, we lost a phenomenal amount. People who drive back and forth through the Sumas Flats area, which Mother Nature tried to take it back in November of 2021 with the atmospheric river and flooded that area. But that would have been a World Heritage Site. Sumas Lake would have been just an extraordinary. Well, for the First Nations, what I know as the Sumas First Nations, it would have been like their breadbasket, their fridge. Some of the stuff that I read, the night flights, the waterfowl were so thick it would blacken out the sun. The mosquitoes were so thick that the First Nations communities built their villages on stilts. And this doesn't come from me. Having that come through First Nations communication, just academic reports that I've read. So I sit there as a biologist, and wow, Sumas Lake must have been something phenomenal. The network of streams flowing through this area, that Vedder Crossing, Sardis area, and through Chilliwack would have been just phenomenal. Just fish numbers, I'm an angler, so I go out and try and catch a few fish. Most of them are hatchery fish, Chilliwack hatchery, and it would have been so diminished compared to the extraordinary ecosystem. So that kind of makes me sad. I'm in this business. I recognize that we're in a planetary collapse. We're really people don't really understand how quickly the planet is collapsing with 8 billion people, almost 8 billion people now on the planet. And things like COVID are just, and, wars in Ukraine and stuff like that. These are just little signs of the landscape starting to blister and sort of fall apart. But, as a biologist, as an angler, as an outdoors person, camping, hunting, hiking, natural resource instructor, it is kind of really sad.
Some of my friends are skeptical of the idea of global warming or climate change, and some of them, it's very hard to change their perspective. But one thing that you can really see, like the ozone layer years ago, where you can actually see it and understand it, is the collapse of different species, is the loss of biodiversity, as it's often called. Within our area, is that something you see, is that we're losing biodiversity, or the numbers of fish and animals and wildlife that used to be here, it's starting to diminish?
Well, I think the problem in the past is that the change was relatively slow. So from generation to generation, the changes were imperceptible, more or less. So if you lived in a village in in feudal England, or you lived in a village out on the banks of the Sumas Lake, or if you lived in some area in the hills in some mountain range in China. Generation after generation after generation, it changed so slowly. And I can see in my own lifetime such rapid changes. It's like, I don't think people kind of understand that. We have a term that I teach in my fisheries course called shifting baseline syndrome. So a very famous scientist by the name of Daniel Pauly out at UBC, he either coined it or he promoted it. And it says from generation to generation, we don't really recognize how good it was before. So there's these intergenerational changes that are imperceptible, and we think we can kind of push it back. But as somebody once said, twice of almost nothing left is still not much left. And so the shifting baseline syndrome is so rapid now that I can see it in my own lifetime, and they say you can't fight City Hall, because City Hall at the core, local governments are really, we have senior governments that do deal with environmental issues, fisheries issues, landscape and ecosystem issues. But when the local community wants to develop something, they do. And there's often very little resistance, even if somebody, is considered a weirdo, enviro freak or whatever, tries to oppose it. There's usually very little resistance to development and loss. And most people, conceptually, verbally, they agree, but most people aren't willing to fight for things often that are really, I think, keystone and critical to future generations.
Interesting. So the common kind of response is, yes, we may have lost some great fish, some great habitats that were naturally here, but now our agriculture industry is just killing it. The argument is often, I think we produce something like 80% of most of the agriculture for BC, and then we're exporting that, and the soil is so fertile, and things we're able to do things so quickly. What do you say to people who have that sort of position?
Well, I guess I can't really say too much. I wrote a major paper on it in somewhere around 2004, I guess. The impacts of agriculture on fisheries in Eastern Fraser Valley. And it's a very detailed, a lot of stuff, historical stuff. Now, here I was born and raised. I have Fraser River mud flowing through my veins kind of thing, right? So I am, this is sort of my home and native land, so to speak, even though my ancestors came from far away. But in the context of the changes that I see, I almost kind of, getting old and grumpy, I think, because I'll drive down the road that I haven't driven down somewhere in Eastern Fraser Valley, and all of a sudden there's a ditch that's filled in that I knew used to have coho or sticklebacks, and I'll see a pond that used to have ducks in it. Now it's got a subdivision on it. Or, there's this grand mansion in an area that was a wooded area. And so that makes me feel sad, but I'm not sure that anything is really going to change. The steamroller of humanity keeps moving on and crushing the weak and the defenseless. And face it, natural resource management is about trying to protect the weak and defenseless, fish and frogs and turtles and birds and mammals and stuff like that. But having a nice house and a nice SUV in the front yard, we all kind of like that. But, it's the other guy's problem. It's not my problem. It's that country's problem. It's not my problem. And so we keep deflecting till we've got nothing left.
Do you feel like materialism has increased over your lifetime? Do you feel like people, it's often referred to, and again, you can be challenged with what things actually were, but it sounds like after World War II, after the Great Recession, people were more frugal. They were more careful about what they bought. They tried to use things to the bitter end. My grandmother was certainly that way. Indigenous communities are often that way. It seems like conserving things, trying to use it to the end, that's not as kind of discussed. And I'm just interested to know, do you think that this growth of, well, I don't just want one car, we need an extra car just in case something comes up. Do you think that that's increased, or is it just human nature to want extra things?
I think it's core human nature. I don't think it's ever changed from the beginning of time. Now, so I'm a child of children of the Depression. And my dad went back to school. He went to grade 7, I think, and decided he didn't want to be a mechanic at Fraser River for the rest of his life. So he actually went back to school, and he ended up getting a university degree, a technical degree at BCIT, and then, because he was a mechanic, heavy-duty mechanic, then went to UBC, got his teaching degree, and then he became a teacher, actually here at Chilliwack Senior Secondary, and then later on at Vetter Senior Secondary. And so for a time period, our family had to be very frugal, so children of the Depression, and then we had our own little, what we called an austerity program, a little mini austerity program when my father was at school. And so at least some of the family, me being the oldest, tend to be very conservative. Take an old pair of running shoes and I'll glue it up. And, not that I can't buy a new pair of running shoes. I got a nice truck and I got a nice house, but, I'm still stitching together things from an old backpack that's got a little rip in it, and batching old fishing rods, and scrounging up lawnmowers that still are perfectly good but maybe aren't the the cleanest and sleekest. So but I think at the core post World War II, I think World War II children and that generation, that was the righteous generation. It knocked them back on their socks so badly in terms of having to be careful that they did, it sort of made them more careful about how they dealt with stuff. But as life got easier, people are maybe more materialistic. But I think the core, if you've got it, you're going to grab it and you're going to flaunt it. I think it's pretty core human nature. Yeah,
one of my big concerns is that maybe there's small benefits, but I think we're heading back to something similar based on the inflation rate, based on kind of our economic decisions. I think we're going to face a pretty rough recession that will give us some of those inklings again.
I would sort of agree with you, but I've seen that sort of perspective. So I'm maybe a little bit older than you, but I've seen this sort of woe is us, things are going to go bad. And we really have a short time frame. 100 years or 75 years or 50 years or 20 years. It's not a very long time period. And we've seen economic cycles, and, I invest RSPs and stuff like that, and I've seen the ups and downs. And I think psychologically, if the resources are there, we will continue to try and hang on to those nice cars and, televisions and nice houses and stuff like that, because we've already got a taste of it. And we will sacrifice a lot of things. We'll sacrifice Site C on the Peace River and oil and gas exploration. And, there's whole areas in northern British Columbia that are crisscrossed by seismic lines. Like back in the 1970s, when I was still a young student, I was just shocked at the devastation of this wilderness, because these guys were cutting these lines and then doing the blasting to figure out seismically where the gas was or oil was. And I think, it was Mr. Gecko said in the movie Wall Street, which sort of dates me a little bit, greed is good. We are a pretty greedy species, and we will, when you look at Jared Diamond's collapse, and you see the collapse of, the Mayan, Easter Island, various communities around the world, societies around the world, and I suspect they weren't dumb people. They built magnificent cultures and buildings and palaces and stuff like that. But greed still ended up tipping them over the edge. And well, in his book, he tries to be optimistic. I'm not nearly as optimistic in respect to planetary. And people, it's not to say we're going to go extinct. We're probably not going to go extinct, but there may be vast changes. COVID was just shut the planet down to the point where we had clean air, clean water. Venice all of a sudden, oh, look at those. You can see the bottom of the canals, and, dolphins are coming to swim in the canals in Venice. And you go like, okay, well, we had a little blip in time. COVID around the world, I don't know what it killed, 5 million people out of 8 billion people. Nothing. A war in Ukraine, that killed, it's front news, everybody's upset about it. But, in terms of the mortality, both citizen and the military mortalities or casualties, it's a tiny, tiny, tiny blip. And so there would have to be a mass catastrophe, I think, to really change our mindsets. These little mindsets are, and you can see it, if you use the stock market, oh, it dropped, oh, all of a sudden it's back up, oh, it dropped, oh, it's, we're a very resilient, invasive species, and perhaps a meteor crashing onto the planet, or maybe a nuclear war. Even if a nuclear war, or a meteor killed 3 billion people, it would still not be, the number of people on the planet would, 5 billion left, would still be only a few decades going back. So we have this geometric progression. So when you loop it back to, southwestern British Columbia, the Vetter River, the Chilliwack River, the richness, we're always willing to compromise, it seems.
I definitely agree. Particularly, like, Ukraine seems to be a good example because, well, it seems like everybody's heart is in it. At the end of each day, it feels like what people care more about is what their gas prices are.
That's right.
More than what's going on there. And when you look at how much Canada, like a lot of the US, the money they're sending is more like debt than it is real, just free flowing financial support. And I think a lot of people kind of get that confused, that there is a repayment plan sort of in place with the Ukraine, that isn't like, oh, we're just 100% invested in that and we're going to go all out. And I was just listening to a CIA analyst kind of break down how to look at this. And he was like, if you look at it more objectively, Russia's starting to win, which is the European countries are starting to go, okay, we need oil. Like, we cannot survive a winter without oil. Our like houses are going to freeze. People are going to die. So how do it's time to resolve, like, people are getting kind of, this can't continue for economic prosperity, not for what's right, what's just, analysis like that. How do you feel then when you're talking about the growth of humans, this concern around Japan? Japan seems to be an example of their oldest populations, their largest. They don't have a growing population, so they're trying to start to look at immigration to bring people in because they don't have enough people, and their country's starting to decrease in size. And people are starting to float the idea of like civilization collapse in terms of us dropping from that 8 billion number downwards. I've seen a few different posts about that, and I'm just, do you think that that's all bunkum, like it's all silliness, or is there any weight to that? I think Japan's the main example right now.
Well, our ecological footprint, so there's some well-known UBC researchers who've talked about the ecological footprint. I think we've, it's a question on one of my exams for my students where I teach at BCIT. We passed the ecological footprint. Boy, I'm going to get heck from my students because I can't remember offhand. But I think it was 1984 is when we, to be able to have a sustainable impact on the planet was something like 1984, I think. So this includes water, sewage, food, air, recycling, the natural recycling of things like CO2 into the atmosphere. And so the question I have is like, okay, I don't know how many people are in Japan. I think Germany is 80 million. United States is 300 million plus. What was wrong with 100 million? Like, why can't we shrink the population size and resource extraction, including the world that I work in, fisheries, is tied to numbers of people, okay? And so we had a little incident here, a little issue over the last year and a half, which was a really gorgeous piece of Fraser River ecosystem just outside of Chilliwack called Gill Bar, Gill Island, Gill Road. And the mud boggers and four-wheel drivers just came in over the last several years. COVID didn't help matters any because people were staying home, and they just thrashed that whole ecosystem. And it's basically a series of wetlands and channels and wooded islands and stuff like that within what we call the heart of the Fraser, a myriad of islands, wetlands, and channels between Hope and Mission here in the Fraser in British Columbia. And we fought the battle, talking to the ministers and resource enforcement guys. I used to go on that bar in my four-wheel drive. We used to walk on it. We used to pick agates. We used to fish on it. We used to do all sorts of things. But the intensity of our use was literally a tiny, tiny fraction of what it ended up becoming in 2020, 2021, 2022. A lot of people really angry about the shutdown of the Gill Bar ecosystem to mud boggers and campers and, just terrorizing the landscape by burning pallets and cars and stuff like that. But I think it had to be done. And it really has to, that area between Mission and Hope, which is called the heart of the Fraser, a bunch of really extraordinary islands that are fish habitat, wildlife habitat, plant habitat. If we want to save the Fraser River, it's an integral part of the Fraser. Why haven't people figured that out already? Okay, we've squeezed the Fraser wetland, channel, stream ecosystem to a tiny sliver of what it was in pre-European settlement, 1800. And now we're destroying the last little bit. And so this massive population squeeze is just basically tearing the landscape apart. And we'll win a few battles, but I'm not sure that we're going to win the war. If children in future generations want to see something that's at least even remotely intact to what it was pre-European, and even probably some aspects of pre-First Nations settlement going back, hundreds of years or maybe even thousands of years.
Can you tell us what it is that makes it beautiful, important for people who are riding their ATVs, who don't understand, who don't have the context of what they're impacting when they're driving along there? My partner and I, when we were walking, we saw somebody land a plane on that kind of rock bed spot, and it was just like, is this the place for that? Is this what's appropriate? Like, it doesn't seem like that one specifically took a lot of critical thinking to go, maybe we shouldn't ride along here. But can you just help people understand what they're impacting?
Well, essentially, the utilization of motorized vehicles is just chewing the landscape up. You can see it, and quite frankly, the enforcement staff, DPhil in the province, so fisheries officers, conservation officers, have never been educated to see what constitutes an intact ecosystem and what constitutes basically a broken ecosystem. And I have no problem with a four-wheel drive going down that bar. And I have no problem with two four-wheel drives going down that bar. But when we have 10,000, and I think we had something like 10,000 or between 10 and 20,000 in our measurement. We had cameras up there to actually do a measurement. It chews the landscape to bits. And the fish, the wildlife, the sturgeon incubation, so sturgeon spawn in the springtime when freshet is high and the whole river is covered over. While in the wintertime when that same river bottom where sturgeon lay their eggs on is chewed up by four-wheel drives and mud boggers and quads, at some point, the whole system unravels. So an intact physical, sometimes you just have to draw boundaries around areas, okay? So from Hope to Mission, I think you have to draw a red line around it. Yeah, there are some activities. First Nations are going to continue to fish it. Sport anglers are going to continue to fish it. There's people that are going to camp. You can have restricted areas. You say, okay, we're gonna sacrifice this area so people can enjoy it. But when you have this sort of mass, it's kind of like Mad Max. It was literally like Mad Max. And we pointed out to the mayor, Ken Popov, what it was like. And people are just kind of sitting there aghast at some of the videos of how things are being destroyed. So somebody at some level in government kind of said, yeah, you know what, there's a small group that I work with called the Gravel Stewardship Group. And we lobbied and lobbied hard, had some good media attention. But this mass of humanity coming down and just basically chewing a landscape up, landscape can't survive that.
Wow. So do you feel like it was a municipal move that really showed support? When you think of what makes an effort successful, because people do protest various issues and fail regularly, do you have any thoughts on what leads a successful campaign to try and protect something like the heart of the Fraser?
Well, at a superficial level, I can say yes, because DFO was the agency that shut it down. Now, the number one damage that to the public viewscape, as it were, is fish and fisheries. But, the mayor might have been calling up the Minister of Fisheries, the guys in Region 2 and in the Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations, might have been sending memos to their minister or ADMs or whatever. And so at a visual perspective, it was DFO that put the signs up in the block, the blockade, the big block concrete barriers. But at the end of the day, there's probably a pile of agency, different political influences, phone calls and stuff like that. And of course, the media helped a lot. The media was really important in influencing it. And so it's tough to say when a decision is made. And I'm pretty tied into, at the ministerial level. I was out on the river with a senior federal minister a few weeks ago, and chat with members of parliament, MLAs and stuff like that. I've done that over the years. You can see where the final decision does come down. And I'm not sure that DFO was the right agency to shut it down. I'm glad that they did. But maybe it should have been the city of Chilliwack. Maybe it should have been the Ministry of Environment, or whatever it's called now, BC Environment, Land Wars in the province. But everybody kind of has a role to play. So it's tough to say who really triggered it, but it's certainly at the sort of open visual perspective was DFO, which was good. Yeah,
because I think of what makes development successful. I'm trying to, it seems like some people who care about the environment, they don't have the resources, the expertise, the collaboration that say a big development company has when they're okay, we're going to go lobby this person, then we're going to go lobby this person, we're going to have dinner with that person. And it's all very business, professional kind of energy. When you hear environmentalists stopping vans or trucks in the middle of a bridge, it's who is going to want to sit down with that person after an incident like that? And I think there is a role to play with that, using your voice strongly, but business seems to win. And there's, beyond just economic success, it seems like there's something in their recipe that's effective in communicating and being someone like yourself, which is just reasonable. Hey, these are the things that are going to happen as a consequence if we do this. If we don't do this, this is going to be some of the consequences we're going to have to look at.
Well, I'm a little bit different than most advocates, environmental advocates, in that I have 10 years of academic training. And I grew up in the Fraser Valley. So this is my territorial imperative, okay? This is the landscape that I feel most attached to, most protective of, most, I'll say, glued to. And so there's a guy by the name of Robert Ardrey who wrote a book called The Territorial Imperative. It says, where you were born and raised, that's the area that you will fight for. So I go to, New Zealand, which I spent time in New Zealand, and I see the same sort of damage that occurs in New Zealand watersheds And I go, oh, no, I really don't like this. And I'm very attached to New Zealand. I spent probably 5 years of my life close to in New Zealand. But when I cycle back, this is the one area that I really fight for. And so this territorial imperative, and I got the academic background, and I've never, I guess I kind of ascribed, I once told an old girlfriend trying to impress her that I was going to be an assistant deputy minister one day. And probably had the qualifications too, but I didn't have the hardwiring. I didn't have the sort of mental, I guess I always kind of felt that when you climbed up the ladder within government or industry or business, you had to compromise a lot. And there's a lot of, I do have to compromise. It's not that, I can't spend my whole life fighting every little creek and every little pond. But at some point in government, and in 2003, I actually basically got pushed out of government. I was told by the Premier at the time. And
sorry, that was Gordon Campbell?
Yeah, Campbell, yeah, I was told he that's what I was told. Anyways, I had a very, how will I put it, what was at that time sort of catastrophic removal out of government into a secondment. I was still paid by the government, but I was interfering with some of the local MLAs and business here in Chilliwack on gravel removal in the Fraser River, plus a big development out at Mission at Silvermere Lake. And so my ability to compromise on some of these issues is probably not very good, much to my sort of social and intellectual detriment, perhaps. But, became very clear quite early on in middle part of my career. I wasn't going to go too far up the ladder in government.
Because you had a limit, because you saw that you had to take a stand at a certain point and you couldn't continue any further down that rabbit hole?
Well, pretty well. One of the issues was the development at Silvermere Lake, and one of the sort of junior techs. So I reviewed a development there. And years later, he said, Marvin, if you would have just written what I told you, you wouldn't have got kicked out of government. Now, I didn't get kicked out of government per se, because I just got reshifted out to UBC, which was it was actually a wonderful experience. Got to work under Daniel Pauly. Basically, what I did was I just hid in a corner and finished up a pile of reports and things that were outstanding in my work in Region 2. With the Ministry of Environment, which at that time was Waterland and Air Protection. And then BCIT came calling, and I've had a wonderful 20-year experience at BCIT over that time frame.
This really, it all comes together. First, I interviewed Lee Harding, who is focused on wolf culling and caribou populations, and he very much described something similar to what you said, which is they formed like a commission on what causes caribou populations to decline, and they determined that it was more about the ecosystems around it than it was wolves. Yeah. They didn't like that. So they said, out with this committee, we're going to bring in a new committee, reform it. Yeah. They need to come to the conclusion that it's wolves. Yeah. That committee did not come to the conclusion that it was wolves. Then they formed a third committee, and they ended up determining that it was wolves that were the problem. And now they wolf cull, which still, when I say that you have to go in a helicopter with a gun and shoot them from the sky, just seems like BC would be so far past something like that. Like, it still just doesn't seem even possible that we do something like that. And then I sit down with Daryl Plekas, who was an MLA in Abbotsford, and he talks about trying to just stop grizzly bear hunting, and how all the research, all the information says that we need to reduce this approach as soon as possible. Yeah. And he's a BC Liberal, so he's sitting in the room with other BC Liberals, hoping they will agree. And he, in the first interview and the second interview, says they never made a decision that he saw that ever was based on what the public interest was always in the interest of who's going to vote for them and what benefits their donors, and that kind of mindset. And that is absolutely terrifying, to think that, like, many people have their kind of suspicions about government. Are they good? Are they bad? What's going on behind the scenes? But for him to just sit down and say that it was not based on what's for the good of the public is very alarming, because we vote these people in. Now, to his credit, he's been very pleased with the direction the NDP has chosen to go in recent years. And he, in our recent conversation, talked about how we need to understand that they have years that they're going to need in order to undo some of the terrible decisions. But I'm interested in your thoughts on specifically Site C, because the NDP fiercely against it. And now I just heard from David Eby, and this is great power for our community. This is going to be a good investment for British Columbians, and we can be confident in our power use. But you mentioned that as something that was maybe bad for the habitat. Can you elaborate on that?
Okay. I don't know the specifics of Site C per se. I've been up to the Peace River back in my graduate school days. And, you know, I know it at a superficial level, but I was working before Site C came online. I was the BC hydrofish, or the hydrofish person out of Victoria for several years. So I was reporting to the assistant deputy minister at the time, John O'Riordan, and a few others. And so I had a familiarity, particularly with the Lower Mainland project. So Walleach, Stave, Ruskin, Cheakamus. Cheakamus was a big battle. BC Hydro was stealing water. They were not licensed to take the water that they were taking. And so I went and applied for the water. I applied for $10 million worth of water per year that they weren't licensed for. Oh, did the crap ever hit the fan on that one? And this was a career-limiting move, right? And one of the senior vice presidents of BC Hydro wrote a note to the assistant deputy minister. I don't know how we're going to get along here when you have these really environmental biologists, you know, trying to be environmental around our around our BC Hydro projects. Okay, so I knew the details of hydro issues, and you know, the extraordinary importance of the Peace flowing northward, you know, in through northern BC and, you know, into the Mackenzie water system is just, you know, and intuitively, when you're screwing up that much of the landscape, you know, when you're affecting large scales of benchland and wetland and changing flow regimes, the impacts are going to be, you know, phenomenal. And this idea, you know, in the old days, it used to just build it. I worked on the Revelstoke Dam project back in the 1970s on the Columbia, you know, and they open the water up in the morning and then at night they shut it down. And, you know, rivers don't work that way. You know, they don't work on a 24-hour cycle. You don't have water pulsing down during the daytime when people at home are turning on their TVs and plugging in their toasters and stuff like that. And then at night you shut off when the power is not needed. And so, you know, intuitively, I'm going to guess the Peace Site C is a really devastating. What do we need the power for? Okay, well, you know what? It's an economic generator. You know, I was really tied into how much the power was worth, how much we were needing in British Columbia. I'm going to guess that it's well in excess of what we need when you have all the independent power projects around British Columbia, then loop on top of that Site C. And so it's for sale. We are now linked into the North American grid. We were not historically linked into the North American grid. And we can now wheel power to back in the day when I was working on down to Texas. We can wheel it down to California. We can trade power. You know, power can be traded on an instantaneous basis between Alberta and British Columbia. So really? The big power plants that are coal-fired in Alberta, they can't ramp up and down with the power regime the way we can in British Columbia. So they can hold its, you know, and I had a cousin who was a power engineer in one of the big facilities in Alberta. So my understanding is that coal-fired plants have to remain stable. So BC Hydro buys and sells power depending on the time of day for things like the piece. It can wheel it back and forth. We can use the power to, I don't know, compress gas in the northeastern part of the province. So, the idea that somebody would say, well, this is a great thing for the province. Well, it might be, in terms of our economic rent and revenue. Hey, I can have 2 4-wheel drives in my front yard rather than just one because we're so rich. But in terms of the ecosystem, sustainability, future generations, EB might be wrong. I would just throw that out there.
So the assumption right now is that we need to go to natural ways, solar energy, hydro. So do you think that we're focusing too much on hydro? Do you think we could do this better? What is kind of the big argument right now is like, we saw the steepest increase in electric cars in the Fraser Valley recently.
Yep.
And so the argument is, well, now that the car is electric, the hydroelectric dam is natural. It's not harmful to the same extent that coal or gas or stuff like that is. So now you have like a green ecosystem. It seems like when I spoke to, I don't know if you know Peter Ross, he's an ocean pollution expert.
Okay.
And he's been doing some research along the Fraser as well in the damage to the ecosystems after the floods. And one of his comments was like, we love our blue bins. We feel good about ourselves with our blue bins. It was invented in Canada. It makes us feel warm and fuzzy that we're doing the right thing. And he was like, they almost do nothing. They have very small impact in comparison to the amount of, like, it basically made us feel okay using plastics because we were like, well, it's being recycled. And it's like, well, a very small amount actually gets effectively recycled. And then you have to use a lot of power in order to break that down and reuse it. And so it isn't an untrammeled good.
Yep.
It didn't fix the problem with plastics.
Yep.
But that's what we want. We want this easy fix. Oh, now we've got hydro, we're good to go. So what are we missing when we're thinking about hydro? It sounds like ecosystems are really impacted.
Well, hydro does a lot of things. It changes flow regimes, which fish are adapted to in streams. It floods terrestrial ecosystems. It releases greenhouse gas, so the methane coming out of the landscape that's flooded, all the vegetation that's left. In some cases, we log the daylights out of that vegetation before the area is flooded. But it still basically disrupts vast areas of ecosystem. And essentially, it's not green. Dams may be less CO2 intensive in terms of their production. So in other words, the greenhouse gases that come out of the flooded landscapes. But, I'm not into it at that detail, so I can't tell what the trade-offs are, say, compared to a, do we want an impacted salmon river? The Coquitlam River was a, Alouette River, Stave River, so lower mainland streams, even to an extent the Walleach Jones facility up the valley near Hope. So the flow regimes are changed, ramping, flows go up and down on a daily basis. Is that ecosystem worth trading off versus maybe a natural gas cogen plant that produces electricity? So I don't know the numbers, but I think really there's a couple of things that are important. One is population control. So that's getting outside of my sphere of sort of expertise, but I do talk a little bit about it in my environmental monitoring course, that that curve that goes like that. And in terms of our ability to control trash, the blue bins, the green bins, we get better, but then the population continues to increase. Lower mainland is going to continue to explode. Every time I go to I'll take a wrong turn and I'll end up in a subdivision or an area that I hadn't been for 3 or 4 years. Oh, there's a huge subdivision. I met somebody up at a golf course in Mission last week, and I got lost. So I got lost because there was roads that were blockaded because there's some construction going on. So I had to make a big loop around. Holy crap, this is a huge subdivision. There's a whole mountainside, and so the concrete trucks and the construction, the wood, piles of wood and asphalt and soil and stuff like that. It's like, just ex nihilo, just out of nothing. All of a sudden, there was a community, in the western part of Mission that would have been probably the size of a town in northern BC. Just boom, and the construction was still going on. And so until we find a way to control population growth, which isn't going to happen. So I'm distressed to hear that Japan might be trying to bring people in. Like, when I was a kid, wasn't the Fraser Valley of, a few tens of thousands of people in Chilliwack a great life? It was a great life. Like, why do I need an extra 4-wheel drive in my front yard when I could go back to my childhood ecosystem and catch frogs in the backyard and have crows cawing on the fence posts and stuff like that? The human mind is a strange and terrible thing.
So my other understanding is that we're looking at bringing even in more people to address the nursing shortage and the doctor shortage, that we are going to start increasing and pitching. If Mr. Eby is elected as the leader of the NDP, he'd like to push the federal government to bring in even more people to the BC to fill those gaps in service. And that would increase our immigration numbers, increase the amount of people. As you've already described, we're increasing a lot. So do you think that we just don't understand the importance of these ecosystems, the impacts that it has? I had an individual, Chris Koo, on, who's a really passionate birder, and he was explaining like a pond in Delta creates this very specific like amino acid that's incredibly important for birds that fly in from like the US or something. Yep. And they eat there, and then they go all the way to like Alaska or something. Like, we don't, normal people, they go, that's a pond. That's a pond like every other pond, but it does something unique. Do you think we struggle to understand the nuances of the different ecosystems and how they play a role?
No, I don't think we struggle. I don't think, and I'm talking about we as a society, we just don't care. Oh. We're not interested. Okay? There's a few, I'll call them weirdos like myself, that, we're lifting up a rock, we're looking at a worm under it, we're looking at, picking up a stick and looking at the squirrel that's trying to hide from you. We're snorkeling down the stream, counting fish and that sort of stuff. But the general public is not really interested in these nuanced aspects of ecosystems. This was an extraordinary ecosystem. The Eastern Fraser Valley, the Chilliwack, is a vast myriad of wetlands and channels. And now we've got a cranberry farm being built on one of the large islands out in the Cohen Island area, Cohen Slough area, cranberry farm. Like this area is flooded every springtime, sometimes right over the top. There's Harrison River sockeye rearing there, Chinook, chum salmon, and I think it's around 240 acres. We're obliterating it. We're allowing it to be obliterated. Like, we're going to build a hatchery. We're going to build a $20 million hatchery down the road, and our operation and maintenance is going to be $2 or $3 million a year. But we couldn't have, and it was for sale 5 years ago. It was for sale for $3 million, and we can't buy and protect a $3 million. It's going to be a lot more now because it's now owned by somebody who's developing it. We can't do that. Like, how insane is that? Like, we kind of think we're rational here in British Columbia. Government, you talk to people in government. I worked in government for a decade and a half, almost 2 decades. Government is not rational in terms of sustainability. It runs on levels of insanity, on mistruths, and basically out and out lies. But, individuals within government, and myself too, when I was in government, even now, it's easy to, well, okay, we can compromise on this, and we can shade that, and we can kind of look the other way for that, and yeah, it'll probably be okay. But at the end of the day, our shifting baseline, the next generation won't have anything that even comes close to being intact.
Was there a point in time where, was it when you were like pushed out from the inner sphere of government that you were involved in, where you started to go, we're not on the right track, and it doesn't seem like there's much of a push to be on the right track? Because personally, I want to see all of these things protected and improved and made better, but it seems like it's not easy to go step 1, step 2, step 3 with the general public. I didn't know about that complex ecosystem there. I would have called it a pond prior. And so it seems like the public is really, to a certain extent, ignorant about the finer details of the consequences of these things. And then to a certain extent, that ignorance impacts our ability to stand up for things.
Well, even with the resource managers don't understand it very well. So I had an interview the other day about fish farms. So with the Fraser sockeye, I'll call it population. It's a myriad of populations, but has done very poorly this year, relatively poorly this year, compared to Alaska, Bristol Bay, pushing 80 million fish, record run. Columbia River, sockeye run, mostly Canadian in the Okanagan system. They've had a little bit of help, but phenomenal run this year, record run. It's a small run. I'll call it again this complex of runs, but the Columbia sockeye run was, I think, close to 700,000 fish. Man, little old Okanagan and Wenatchee, the two main systems in the Columbia that produce sockeye, had more sockeye coming back in 2020. I think for the whole Fraser system had 350,000 roughly fish and change. The whole Fraser ecosystem could only produce 1/3 sockeye. And little old Skaha Lake, Osoyoos Lake, Wenatchee Lake can produce twice that amount? Okay, and why aren't all the 92 plus or minus First Nations bands up and down the Fraser, why isn't every commercial fishing entity, why isn't every sport fishing entity, why isn't just people that like to know that there's intact sockeye runs, and the other salmon populations are in the same boat, really. You know, we have a few little bright spots here and there, but for the most part, Fraser River salmon ecosystems have collapsed. In my view, strong view is that it's tied to fish farms, okay? But there's a whole body of information that I've looked at that leads me to that conclusion. Why aren't these groups all just going to Ottawa and basically, I don't want to sound like I'm fostering a revolution, but basically burning the place down, saying you have to do something. Okay, the salmon and steelhead collapses within the Fraser and Greater Georgia Basin ecosystem, and Puget Sound's affected as well. The Salish Sea ecosystem, from a salmon perspective, has absolutely collapsed. And why aren't people just going crazy telling government and whomever that this has to be fixed? This is like the dodo going extinct. It's like passenger pigeons. Yet in 2022, you know, we had, right now it's just under 6 million coming back. So we went in 2010, around 28 million sockeye coming back. 2014, 20. 2018, it was 10. And it was 5 and change. I think it's the in-season estimate is up to 6 now. But and again, Coho, Fraser Coho basically collapsed. Fraser Steelhead, including winter runs, summer and winter runs. Fraser Chinooks, and we have these little bumps and we go, oh, well, everything's going back. But in reality, if you look at the long-term trends since the 1980s and early 90s, for the most part, everything has gone in a downward direction. But hey, can't be fish farms because, it's the seals and sea lions. No, it's climate change. No, it's urbanization. No, and so you have even the scientists, the biologists, and the resource managers are at odds with one another. How is the general public going to figure that out? And so it makes it easy for monolithic block like the fish farming industry. Say, "Oh, you know, we've got the science. It's not an issue. Blah blah blah."
Right.
And you know, it's a multi-billion-dollar. I forget what the gate receipts are for. You know, it's several $billion in British Columbia. It's the biggest agricultural product in British Columbia. And the Cohen Commission said, "Hey, take them out of there by 2025." Well, took a few out of Broughton Archipelago, and there's now fish farms taken out a Discovery Passage, which is that Fraser River pathway for the little babies to go out. Disease, sea lice attached to the sides of the bodies of the fish and kind of chew them up and make them less viable for survival. But hey, you know, and so the big run, 220, 218, 214, 210, 206, that sort of cycle of runs, which is mostly the big Shuswap, South Thompson watershed. You know, the runs into the subdominant and non-dominant year classes or cycles, because sockeye mostly a 4-year cycle, not always, but mostly, have mostly collapsed as well. Like, this is insane. Yeah. But we're willing to kind of look sideways. We're not willing, you know, like again in the Fish Farm Cohen Commission, mostly, you know, I actually testified on at least one on habitat issues, mostly Fraser River gravel, and I did 3 reports for the Cohen Commission. It's just it was mostly just lawyers making lots of money in my view at the end of the day. And I was interviewed prior to the Cohen Commission getting started when they first announced it, and I said, well, I guess we'll see at the end of the day. And some fairly prominent members of Parliament, you know, in environmental critics or fisheries critics came and talked to me. I said, gave them my presentation. I said, wow, what can we do? And I said, well, you know, you guys, I didn't say it exactly, but, you know, you guys kind of were probably the issue for it happening. I said, you can get some information doing trial removals. Nootka Sound, Steelhead, the Gold River have basically collapsed. It flows into Nootka Sound, just plugged with fish farms. You do some experimental stuff. But I don't think governments are willing to really do the hardcore experimental stuff that is required to get an answer.
Can you explain what a fish run is, like the process? Because you hear, oh, this is a big run this year. It's going to be huge. How does this function? What is it like? How do you understand the migration of fish? Because as I spoke to Dean about, they move so many different spots. We can't just go, oh, they're going to go here, they're here, then here. They're fish. They go where they like, and they'll stop in different spots. So how do we think about just the migration of fish?
Well, I guess in terms of migration, and I'll stick to salmonids, salmon and trout, and they have relatively similar life history patterns. Salmon are mostly anadromous. In other words, they go born in freshwater, might rear a little bit, go to sea, get most of their body mass in the ocean, and come back and spawn and die. And trout are steelhead, the anadromous version, does sort of the same thing. In terms of what we would consider the keystone or capstone species in British Columbia, Pacific salmon, there's 5 species, and probably the most high-profile one in British Columbia is sockeye. So I'll kind of concentrate on sockeye, but Chinook have a very widely ranging life history pattern. I think there's number of Chinook runs in the Fraser watershed is huge in terms of the number of runs, but in terms of the population numbers, there's only several 100,000 fish coming back to the Fraser. Whereas sockeye, even up until 2010, there was close to 30 million fish coming back. And so I'll stick to that life history. So sockeye, very prized, First Nations up and down the coast, not so much in the Columbia South, except for that couple of little runs in the Okanagan and Wenatchee, so Oregon and Central South British Columbia. But Fraser watershed in British Columbia was really subject to a lot of intense glaciation. So we've got these great big long trough lakes. So we've got we've got Shuswap Lake, we've got Chilko Lake, we've got Quesnel Lake, we've got up in the Stewart Tack, we've got all these long, skinny, deep, cold, probably usually nutrient poor, oligotrophic, call it oligotrophic lakes. So low nutrients, low productivity, that sockeye, when they come back to streams, most sockeye spawn in streams, although for salmon, they sometimes spawn in lakes. See, life history variation. The little babies incubate over the winter time. So sockeye salmon spawn in the fall. We'll take Adams River as an example. The embryos, so just basically an egg that's starting to go through cell division, basically develops inside the eggshell like a chicken for about 3 months, hatches somewhere around Christmas time. Then the little wiggler, which is a larva called an elvin, sits there using up the yolk sac and becoming a little fish. Baby fish comes out of the gravel, and sockeye go to a big lake. So they were in a lake for about a year. So they get to be about that big. We call them, they turn silvery, they become a smolt, and they whistle out through the Fraser. They might come down the Adams, South Thompson, into the Fraser, down into the estuary and out to sea. Sockeye probably don't like estuaries that much. They're big enough to go out to sea. So chum and chinook really like estuaries, and to a lesser extent pink salmon that have a shorter life history. So they go out to sea, so they're migrating. Fraser River sockeye smolts, as do most salmon smolts, not all, but many of them, go northward once they hit salt water, just past the ferry slip, North Arm, Point Grey, and they essentially go up through the myriad of islands and channels between main body, northern Vancouver Island, and the mainland. And so rich feeding ground, they go through all these islands, which of course are protected from big storms and waves and stuff like that, which is why the fish farmers like to site their facilities in these protected bays where the little sockeye and other species are kind of wandering along the edge. Oh, there's a big net there. Oh, there's nice food. I just got a sea louse attached to me because these fish farms are concentrators. They're biomagnification of sea lice. And then if they survive it, they go up past Port Hardy, Queen Charlotte Sound, and then boom, out in the open ocean. So 4-year cycle mostly for Fraser sockeye. And so we have 6 months in the gravel as an embryo, fertilized egg, or as an elvin, as a larva. Then we have 1 full year in freshwater, rearing in a lake, so that's 1.5 years. So then you take 4 years, subtract 1.5 years from it, so that's essentially 2.5 years out in the marine environment. So they're going round and round and round in the open Pacific, feeding in these very rich areas offshore. So us sport anglers like to catch Chinook and coho that often will stay close to the inland waters, inland marine waters, but sockeye, pinks, and chums go offshore. And that's how come the Alaskans get a hold of them, because some of them come out through Alaska down back to British Columbia. We don't like that. And so they spend basically close to, a little bit more than 2 years, and then they come back. They'll do landfall for Fraser sockeye. They'll either come to northern Vancouver Island, come around the top, and then down through Johnson Strait, Discovery Channel, the various Seymour Narrows. And that's where some of the big seine and gillnet fisheries are. And then down through to the mouth of Fraser. Or some years they will landfall closer to the southern end of Vancouver Island. And then in those years, the diversion rate, so this was generally a higher diversion rate south through Juan de Fuca. And so in the old days, bad old days, Americans used to really pound them before they got into Canadian waters because they went through their national waters. We now have the Pacific Salmon Treaty and the Pacific Salmon Commission allows for sort of a negotiated, safe, and mostly harvested by Canada agreements. So we catch American fish off of Tofino or Ucluelet because their Chinooks are going by. So we do these trade-offs. Anyway, so early Stewart fish are the nicest of the fish. I once caught one, probably illegally, a sport when I was a kid. Took it home. Oh, this is Chinook. No, it's sockeye. Anyway, that was a bad thing I did back in 1973, and we put it on the barbecue, and my goodness, it just melted on the barbecue. The fat and the juices. It was just one of the most scrumptious salmon that I'd ever eaten. So First Nations really, really, really like those early Stewart fish because the first some Chinooks that come earlier, some steelhead, a few odds and ends, but early Stewart sockeye and that one fish that I caught when I was 17 years old really impressed me at how fat and how rich and how silvery it was. And I can understand why those early fish in June are so prized, historically by First Nations communities. And then they, we got these other runs further north are usually earlier, although we got some oddballs like Chilliwack River sockeye that go through better Chilliwack Lake and then up into, well, it's actually down if you're looking north-south, but across the border down into the States. So some of the sockeye spawn on the Canadian side of the border, but the rest of the watershed, which is intact, Americans haven't really logged it. The upper Chilliwack watershed. And so they, in effect, spawn up there. And so over June, July, August, and into September, we have these later and later runs that come through and do their spawning, and then the whole cycle starts again.
Yeah, because this year we did our salmon ceremony only like a little over a month ago in our community because it was our first catch. It was our first ability to kind of bring that home to the community because everything was happening so late. Dean talked about how he loves these fish, how he cares about them, how he sees the value they bring, but like for people, it's easy to look at dogs like a friend, something to admire. They might look at bears or other wildlife like it's living, but we seem to struggle with trees, with bugs, with fish, as like what is there to love about them and what is there to admire. And it seems like that is the drop-off point for some people when we're talking about fish farms is my fish comes in a can. Like I buy it at the grocery store. There isn't when you hold it, it's slimy to people. Like they don't have maybe a memory that connects them the way Dean had talked about, the way you sort of talk about that relationship with the fish. Can you just describe your relationship, why you admire what you see in these animals that so many might miss out on?
Oh boy, you're parsing into the deep psychological depths of my personality here.
Doing my best.
This is dangerous territory, I think. I don't know. I just always fascinated by them. They were just creatures that they were just different. In the Eastern Fraser Valley, I think one of the first sort of things that really struck me was in our ditch on Banford Road, again, south of the highway. So those ditches have changed over the years. The city of Chilliwack digs them deeper and deeper, and there's more manure coming into them, less riparian buffer zones. In the old days with barbed wire fences, you didn't cut the grass right to the edge of the ditches. You actually left a little natural buffer zone. And so those ditches had cutthroat trout, they had coho in them, and I remember skating on the ditch, and there were frozen sticklebacks frozen into the ice. And I looked down and go, wow, look at that. The three-spined sticklebacks. And they're frozen, like, you go to the gift shop, and you've got like a little snowman frozen into a glass ball, and you hang it on your tree. And this is what it was like. And I have no idea. I know that my dad had a fishing rod in our old shed. It was a steel rod. So this was 19 1950s, 1960s, and this fishing rod, it was useless, and it was a piece of junk, but I was just fascinated by it, and I think that kind of thing just basically took me into a different sort of psychological level, right? Why is a professional tennis player, as good as he or she is? Because there's some psychological hardwiring that occurs at a very young age, and they become good at it. And so, mostly, I think one of the reasons that I was not interested in climbing the corporate ladder in government was I wanted to be out fishing. But I knew how to get an education if I wanted to do well in this particular profession. And so my friends were out on the Fraser River catching Harrison jacks, 1973. They're out there having these great days. And I'm sitting in math in my first year of university, calculus, and I'm going like, ugh. My friends are catching fish. I'm sitting here. Those fish might disappear one of these days. I already kind of had a premonition that, many of the runs that I knew when I was a young man or child would essentially be gone by the time I got into my adulthood. And so I'm closer to retirement. I'm a little bit choked because a lot of the runs of salmon that I used to fish have basically been shut down. Not just me. First Nations are severely curtailed. Commercial fisheries are curtailed. Marine sport, we've just had this just basically shut down of these ecosystems. So anyways, I think somewhere in my youth, I think it was because I was such a terrible angler. Not a good angler, okay? I catch a lot of fish now because I can do it, but that's not because I'm particularly skilled. I'm just persistent about it. And so it irritated the daylights out of me that I wasn't good at it. So it made you, it's kind of like the tennis, he tries harder, and the hockey player tries harder and harder to get good at it. And so that kind of looped back to me. I'd be just happy to be on the bank catching fish. I like killing fish too, which is a bad thing. I like taking home salmon. I like eating them. I like smoking them. I like canning them. Turning them into sushi, whatever. I'm going to have a barbecue this afternoon with some friends. A hatchery produced Vetter Chilliwack hatchery Chinook salmon. Okay, I just like it. I just love it. So my interest would rather have been out there in the water, but I knew I had to have this educational background to be able to help make decisions to protect my ability to go out there with the fishing pole sitting on the edge of the Fraser River. Mm. So I guess when what is that core? Why do I like fish? They just seem like a fascinating group of animals. I tell it to my students, they go, well, okay, Marvin, you take your sort of idiosyncrasy and, we'll listen to you for a while. We'll get educated on a topic A, B, or C, but then, we're going to go have the rest of our life. And I recognize that. I recognize that people, not everybody can be passionate or interested in one or another thing.
Is there a favorite fish for you? Dean talked a lot about, I think it's steelhead that are like they're like dinosaurs. I might have
Sturgeon.
Sturgeon,
yeah. Chinook salmon, great big Chinook. That rod bent over and packing it back to the boat and taking it home and carefully filleting it and then putting it on the barbecue or smoking it or canning it. These great big monsters that, make now, notwithstanding that, sturgeon get to be a lot bigger. And Dean Work, who's a fishing guide, very well-known fishing guide in the Fraser Valley, got me into an 8-footer in a very heavy current the other day. My shoulder, I think, is still sore from that, fighting that big fish. But for whatever reason, Chinook salmon, those great big silver, gorgeous, the early runs, which we can't fish anymore, they've basically fallen to bits in terms of their population numbers. That would be my favorite. But any carp, I'd be interested. holding a carp, catching, and I don't really care, you know, I like angling, but I would just be as happy to gill net them,
Right.
or pitchfork them, or gaff them, or snorkel and just look at them, or catch and really, you know, I'm not a resource user wantonly. You know, I'm very careful about when I handle fish, but I do like fish in my freezer. I enjoy eating them, notwithstanding that I've had so many salmon in my life. I'm a little bit tired. I, you know, like halibut bitter now, I think. but you know, I don't know. They're just interesting animals. They just and there's no explanation for it. It's just maybe it's a bit of a mental illness or something.
No, it sounds like a really good thing that other people are missing out on, which is causing some sort of mental illness. But what is the relationship between killer whales? There's that pod, I want to say, that are really interested in only eating Chinook salmon.
I think it's the southern resident killer whales in Salish Sea, Gulf of Georgia, Puget Sound area.
How does that happen?
I don't know. Somehow or other, they were adapted, you know, over the last probably 10,000 or 100,000 years to eat Chinook salmon. So Puget Sound, lower and upper Georgia Basin, you know, had always pre-European settlement and industrial fishing had large numbers of Chinook salmon in addition to all the other species. And I think the pod or pods of whales, because Chinook, somebody asked me about that the other day, you know, and I've heard stories of killer whales up in Vancouver Island, the Eve River, where I fly fish for pinks, pushing pinks right up against the shore and eating them, okay? And I've heard other folks talk about sockeye. Chum, I think, are also, you know, chum can be big-bodied. They're the second largest of the 5 Pacific salmon. But Chinook salmon historically were in the Gulf of Georgia basically 365 days of the year. So pink, sockeye, chum, gone. Coho are a smaller species. They only kind of they're smaller body species. They only end up being a reasonable size after about June of their last year. They grow very quickly. But Chinook, you know, historically we had big Chinooks swimming around the Gulf of Georgia. Very nutritious package of food. You know, like me, I like these great big silver, beautiful, you know, muscular animals. And so in that context, I think that's why you had this particular group of killer whales. And killer whales are ubiquitous around the planet. You know, some of them eat mammals. You know, they'll chomp on a seal or something, right? But for whatever reason, it is in sort of the southern Gulf of Georgia, Salish Sea, Puget Sound area. These guys seem to have cottoned onto Chinook salmon.
Right. Fish farms. What do we do about them? How did they come about? Do you think that fish farms are all bad? Is there a place for them? How do they function? There seems to be real concerns. I've spoken to Eddie Gardner, Dean Work, Carrie Lynn Victor. They've all talked about the problems with fish farms. How did we get here?
Well, it's interesting because this is a lecture that I'm going to give this week about fish production worldwide. So fish production worldwide post-World War II started to build up and then hit about 80, 90 million tons, okay? And the world population, so that's about the cap in world production. Bit under 100 million, depending on who you talk. Some say there's underreporting by China, but somewhere around 80 million tons. But we worldwide produce, I'm going to say somewhere around 160 million tons. And that gap is taken up by aquaculture, both marine and freshwater. So China has the largest aquaculture. Freshwater is the biggest. And so we almost can't live without fish farms generically, okay? But if we drill down to British Columbia and its salmon fish farms in southern British Columbia, so Clayoquot Sound and Upper Gulf of Georgia and Nootka Sound and all of these Georgia Basin between the northern east coast of Vancouver Island and the mainland, the inlets and little bays and stuff like that, channels, very protected. And so from about the early 1990s, we went up sort of like that, and it kind of has sort of leveled off now. And if you look at the number of coho, chinook, steelhead, sockeye, the relationship is fish farms this way, and the salmon and steelhead populations going in the sort of opposite direction. And the correlation is pretty tight. There's some natural experiments that are pretty, again, the multiple lines of evidence, in my view, in my analytics, are very different than most people's assessments. So basically they exploded. They exploded in British Columbia because offshore money, a lot of Norwegian funding coming in. And so it became big business. I know people who I would consider to be friends who have absolutely no problem with fish farms. They have no influence on natural native populations. I don't believe that. And again, this isn't the forum to really talk about it because I've gone through a lot of detail in terms of my analytics, correlative detail, and essentially, I'm convinced. And but it's such a large business sector for a certain group of the economy of British Columbia that once they're in there, it's hard to wedge out. And that's kind of I would say an example of how, if you're going to do something, it's bad, you got a pretty good idea that it's bad right from the beginning. We always talk sustainable development and precautionary principle. Most of that is crap. It sounds good on paper. It sounds good when you're talking to the members of the UN. But reality is that Brundtland Commission and things like that, sustainable development, any development is probably negative, and the really bad ones I think include fish farms. And so that's where we're at. And so there's some intense pressure, some by First Nations. Now the First Nations communities support it because it provides employment up and down the coast into some communities that don't have a lot of economic opportunities. So you understand the pain that they may feel by having fish farms removed. But, again, I believe that it is cultural genocide. I think that fish farms have basically obliterated, and First Nations communities still get fish under Section 35, rights and titles, food, social, and ceremonial under the Constitution. But when there's nothing left of something, people change and they forget. And they forget these, at a family perspective, my own family, spent an enormous amount of time on the Fraser River catching sockeye and chinook, just wonderful times, wonderful family times. And I feel for First Nations communities, particularly some of the ones in the northern, Chaco. So I worked on the court case with 2 First Nations, the Latin Scouts, on flows for sturgeon. And so the generations, and I had a student from the Fort Fraser area, one of the First Nations last year. When it's gone, then that continuity that occurred since First Nations colonized the coast of British Columbia after the last ice age, 10,000 years. And the continuity of European communities that, lived and breathed and survived on the economics or the food provided, the recreational stuff by me. I think fish farms have essentially been the result of a component of cultural genocide within these various communities, sport, recreational, First Nations, commercial, up and down the coast of British Columbia, because so many of these groups were tied to Fraser River salmon runs. Okay, so I think it's a terrible thing. I think we do not understand. 100 years from now, when maybe we figured out what the damage was by fish farms to a family living on the Skeetchison Reserve, on the Thompson River, or somebody who lives in the Chilco area. This is fish farms are a horrible, horrible thing to the social network of Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities in British Columbia, I believe.
Wow, that is very well articulated. What are the effects for fish? You mentioned fish lice. What problems do they create? It sounds like there's these locations where they're breeding fish and trying to grow them, but they're not well. Carrie Lynn Victor described some that swim into the same thing again and again and again, and they're not like intelligent to the way you expect other fish to behave.
You're referring to the fish inside the pens.
Yeah.
Well, British Columbia has pretty well adopted, the fish farming industry has adopted Atlantic salmon as its main species of culture. And I know a bit about fish culture because at one point I was connected to the Freshwater Fisheries Society and the hatchery system at a personal level. And so, I know the fish cultures, I know the DFO hatchery guys. A lot of my students work in hatcheries, so I know a little bit about sort of the genetics and behavior and stuff like that. There were these real fears early on in the 1990s, and I heard the stories because, there was some fight put up by provincial in particular, not so much federal only, but provincial fisheries managers, so mostly sport fishing, that Atlantic salmon were going to escape, they were going to colonize streams, they were going to outcompete the native stocks, and then there was the issue of disease, both, things like viral or bacterial. But the one that I think, and when I say fish farms, I think are deleterious, I'm looking at sort of the macro level, the correlative level, not down. Even though I did review one of the papers, one of my reviews for the Cohen Commission was on disease and fish farms. I kind of get a sense that the collapse is tied to sea lice. It just seems to me sea lice makes the most sense. And I'm really careful, very cautious, very conservative about my statements. But, over the last 10 or so years, 15 years that I've been working on this issue, I'm absolutely convinced that fish farms are the most deleterious. Since the Hell's Gate disaster in around 1913, that basically when the railroad construction blasted a bunch of rock at Hell's Gate, more or less blocked salmon runs in the upper Fraser. I think fish farms have been the biggest catastrophic collapse, notwithstanding, the development, Roberts Bank and the estuary, a bunch of other things. I think that, there's the sort of death by 1,000 cuts, more people putting inputs into our Fraser River sewage-wise, again, forest practices, which are more or less figured out. I still believe, and it is my opinion, that fish farms have been by far the most catastrophic effect to British Columbia's salmonid ecosystems. Heck, Port Alberni and the sockeye runs, the coho runs, the chinook runs, some of them hatchery, some of them wild. Barkley Sound has almost no fish farms. Boom. Those runs have maintained stability. They vary. What people don't seem to understand is natural semi-decadal or decadal oscillations. There's El Nino, La Nina effects, and all sorts of open ocean effects that are natural, that are large cycles over time, big variations between the peaks and the bottoms of the troughs. Notwithstanding that, Barkley Sound runs of sockeye, as an example, have maintained relatively stable. Steelhead has been a bit of a problem the last few years in the Barkley Sound runs, Stamp River, but for the most part, it's stayed very stable. Things like Dean River steelhead, as an example, you can see even the Skeena that has had some problems the last few years. For the most part, if you look at the trajectory of most runs in the Fraser versus Skeena has more or less stayed relatively stable. And it's easy for people to, climate change. I really don't like, climate change. Yeah, climate change has almost certainly deleterious impacts that we don't understand that will, we haven't even scratched. My life, I'll be long gone before we understand the issues of climate change. Some of the big runs in Alaska are being touted as being beneficiaries of climate change, warmer waters, more productivity. But hey, little old runs in Columbia River at the very south end of the range, exploded this year, way higher than. So we had Alaska this year at 90 million or 80 million. Columbia River sockeye runs at 700,000, unprecedented in modern times, 93.5. And Fraser River watershed is boom, the most iconic piece of British Columbia landscape and water, ecosystem and human, First Nations communities, commercial fishermen, sport fishermen, all the whole gambit. And the ecosystem features, bears eat salmon, seagulls eat salmon, bears crap in the bush after they've eaten salmon. That fertilizes riparian areas. The marine derived nutrients, the nitrogen and phosphorus that historically, particularly pre-European, had been brought back onto the landscape and essentially fertilized the landscape around these huge salmon rivers. It's gone. It's just disappeared. It's just it's phenomenal. And then we say, we can develop these islands in the Fraser River, heart of the Fraser between Hope and Mission, just a bunch of islands. Wait a sec here. 99.999% of the salmon runs go through there. A lot of the runs are beneficially affected when the water comes up and floods the big islands. They're positively affected. Oh, we're going to develop them. Oh, it's no problem. We'll get a environmental biologist. Oh, well, we'll put a circle around this little patch of water, and okay, it'll be okay. It's not, But overarching all of these other impacts, in my view, the salmon farming industry in British Columbia is by far the most deleterious.
What are the things that cause harm to them? What do sea lice do to these salmon that cause such problems? Well,
sea lice are essentially an ectoparasite, and they attach. So pink salmon might be that big, the sea lice might be that long, and it attaches to the side of the body of the fish, basically bores a hole into the side of the fish and sucks the juices out, right?
So it's like a leech.
It's almost like a leech. It's not in the same taxonomic category, but yeah, it's like a leech. It just attaches and sucks the juices out of the baby salmon, and so these fish are going through osmoregulatory transformations. So,
what is that?
Essentially, fish in freshwater, because the cells within the body of the fish, the tissues, the muscles, have more salt. Water tries to go in fresh water because they're trying to create an osmotic balance. So the kidneys are working overtime to push fresh water out of a fish. When they go into a marine environment, it's backwards because the marine environment is so salty. In effect, the fish has to conserve water, and it has to push salt out because it's got salt cells and that actually take salt out of the water that fish are being absorbed through the gut or through the skin, and it has to push salt out, and it has to conserve water. So you bore a great big hole in the side of a little baby salmon because your parasite's that long and your salmon's that long, and you poke a bunch of holes in it. Essentially, it's like taking a pin to a water balloon and you're pricking it, and all of a sudden, essentially, you got all that leakage. And so that's kind of a layperson's attempt, or a layperson type of description of what happens. Physiologically, I'm sure it's a lot more complicated than that, but that's my sort of layperson explanation.
Brilliant. The Cohen Commission, we've talked about it briefly here and there. When did this come about? And what was it like to be involved? Do you have hope that commissions like this push us slowly in a better direction?
Well, I was part of the Cohen Commission on a number of different levels. So, for example, I was hired to review habitat issues, disease issues. There was another report, another subject that I reviewed. And I was also asked by the BC Wildlife Federation to talk about what I thought was a really critical issue, just talk, and I felt fish farms. So I went and put together this sort of prototype analytics, and for some reason or other, the mentor, the guy by the name of Bill Otway, who was quite a strong personality, passed away about that time. And so my presentation never made on what I felt, the correlative analysis never made the picture. And I testified actually in 2011, and I know it's 2011 because that was during the Stanley Cup riots. So my last day testifying in court in front of Judge Cohen, you could hear the guys with their drums and prior to the hockey game making a noise, and so we're sitting there testifying, and down on George and Granville Street, the crowds were coming in for the game. So that really impressed me, and that's why I can remember that was the date. So there was a lot of preparation up to that point, and I had reviewed a number of different topics, but we had a number of collapses of sockeye, like what's new in the Fraser River, right? And so it was weird that in 2010 we had this massive run, sort of a modern record, and I have my sort of suspicions about that, why it happened, but in any event, the Cohen Commission, I think, was sort of well-meaning, but I don't know that it necessarily really... It seemed to be run more by lawyers than it was run by hardcore scientists, notwithstanding the fact that there were some really good scientists that provided input. But the core question, I think the core question in everybody's mind was, is it fish farms? And that was never answered. And in fact, there's no smoking gun was the statement. I think that the Cohen Commission failed to really address the question that was in everybody's mind, is it fish farms or not?
Right.
And so I don't want to step on too many feet because some of the scientists involved I know at a personal level, but if I was running it, which there's no chance that I would have wanted to put a lot more effort into asking and trying to answer that question. And so following from that, there were a bunch of recommendations and, probably some of the stuff that I worked on, there's a whole list of them. I forget what the number, fish farms out by 2025. Well, we're just about at 2025. Joyce Murray, who was a minister up until last week, Fisheries minister up until last week, when she stepped down due to health reasons.
Was that a loss?
I think it was a loss. But there's a whole back history. Joyce Murray is a British Columbian. She's a natural resource person. Her background is in forestry, tree planting, and I think she was actually the minister when I was removed from government in 2003. I think she was my boss, actually. In any event, I had been asked by the federal government to give presentations. It actually goes back to the days of the Pacific Fisheries Resource Conservation Council in the late 90s. And I think that John Fraser was the chair of that. He was a Minister of Fisheries and he was Speaker of the House at one point. And I think that was another collapse in sockeye. We were 24 hours or 48 hours from losing because there was some screw up in assessment of sockeye numbers. So I wrote a bunch of habitat reports for the Pacific Fisheries Resource Conservation Council. So I've been advising DFO and the senior fisheries folks for quite a few years. And then, so I think I had 8 habitat reports. And then moving forward to standing committee, Fisheries and Oceans, Ottawa, flew to Ottawa once on Fraser River gravel removal. And then another time, 2021 on habitat generally, to the standing committee. And then Joyce Murray's folks called me up in January, so I talked to her face-to-face over the internet in January 17th. And then again, took her out on the Fraser River in July of this year, 2022. And I think, the one thing about Joyce is that she told us she wanted to be effective. She wanted to be effective. And I got a sense that she was really being honest with me. And, I've talked to MLAs and members of parliament and city council over there, and some of them, you can tell their eyes glaze over very quickly. Yeah. And I got a sense that Joyce was at a stage of her life and her career where she wasn't prepared to stand down on things that she thought she could be effective at.
It was time to spend the political capital.
Yep. So she didn't have a 20-year political career ahead of her at 68. I think she was 68 when she stepped down. Well, Donald Trump will go till the end of time, I guess, and Joe Biden will go to the end of time, and Putin, all these guys, they should have, and my brother-in-law says, we need to turn these decisions over to the younger generation. And I agree with that. Although I think, in my career, I think the wisdom, I think certain cultures, maybe the Japanese culture or Chinese culture, value the wisdom of older people. I think some of the First Nations communities value the wisdom of older people a lot more than, say, modern European and North American societies. And so I think Joyce Murray had a level of wisdom, or has a level of wisdom, that was sort of uncommon amongst a lot of members of parliament and MLAs, maybe local council members. And so I was basically shocked. I was shocked when she, now we have to train up a new minister again, explain it all to them, why this is important, why that is important. So that going back to your question about Joyce, I think that was really kind of disappointing to see her have to step down.
Yeah. There's a theme arising from my understanding outside of government, never having worked with them, because Lee Harding described something very similar to you, which was around ATVs in the north. Apparently, they will clear out a bunch of trees so people can go ATVing, and then the smoothing of the snow due to the ATVs makes it very easy for wolves to get around even faster.
Yeah.
And his argument is, if we reduced this, or if we limited their ability to roam free, then caribou would be able to get around and not have to stress about being cut off by wolves, who can now move at a faster pace because of what we're doing. And the BC government at the time basically said, we're not interested in that because it's such good business. They're bringing in such revenue, and it sort of overlaps with your finding of these fish farms. They're bringing in revenue, creating jobs. And so it's like we're a little bit addicted to the opportunities economically and employment-wise that they bring in for our community members, that it's hard to get off of it. It's hard to say, okay, we're going to invest in this because there's consequences long-term for our society.
Yeah, well, ask the Soda Creek band whether they like being constrained from the early Stuart sockeye, or the Stillatin band, or a commercial gillnetter in the lower Fraser River that's been fishing for 3 or 4 generations, or a sport marina in Pender Harbor that had, docks and boats, rentals and motels, and it's easy to see this concentrated value, fish farm A, fish farm B, making, $10 million per farm, or 10, I don't know the economics of it, the large amount of money, but when you see the cultural and social diversity being lost from, Stuart Lake and up at McBride, and through the my friends in the Shuswap drainage, my First Nations friends that live, at Adams Lake and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, what happened for 10,000 years is gone. The negative externalities from an economic perspective, I'm not an economist, but the negative externalities seem to me intuitively, when you take all these little spots of social and social capital and economic capital, First Nations communities, derived food sources, they derived income, they derived, over the last 10,000 years from these runs of fish. And then all of a sudden, that money is concentrated in a few little fish farms scattered on Vancouver Island, and it's being piped to Norway because these companies are owned by the Norwegians. And yeah, there's local businesses and employment. I just think it's a tragedy. I think it's an absolute tragedy to the 92 plus or minus First Nations communities up and down the Fraser, the First Nations communities from Port Hardy right down to down in the Nooksack that would have gone into marine waters. The folks around the Orcas Islands, both First Nations and otherwise, they can't do it anymore. As a kid, you'd go out on the ferry from Horseshoe Bay to Vancouver Island, the fleet of little boats fishing coho and chinook, like the Vancouver Sun Fishing Derby, every summer, or whatever it was, August 1st or whatever, Sun Salmon Derby, and the same guys would win every year, and the whole golf, it's all disappeared. It's just gone. It's just absolutely. Well, no, it's logging, it's urbanization, it's climate. It's all crap. The one defining feature that really, I believe, and yeah, maybe seals are an issue with regards to predation of Chinook and Co. or some of the other species, large bodies. But we've had species after species, population after population, and I just can't get my head around it being anything other than that one hotspot. Do we have to fix urban stream issues, riparian area protection regulation, all that kind of stuff? Yeah, forest practices code, FERPA, it's now called FERPA. There's probably some glitches. Yeah, I can show you some bad logging practices. But the number one issue to me keeps coming back to this really bad hotspot that occurs in sensitive areas of smalled-out migration.
So would you get rid of all of them? If you had a magic wand and we could bypass the bureaucracy, we could accomplish something in regards to fish farms, what would that look like?
Well, I was, again, tightly linked into the fish culture industry for about 16 years of my life. It helped pay off part of my mortgage, so to speak. And so, I know, the economics are not, it's not easy, for example, to do land-based fish farming. If it was that easy in British Columbia, it'd be a fish farm on every, we would convert our fields out here in East Chilliwack or out on the Sumas lake bed or into fish farms, and in some cases we are turning those agricultural lands into greenhouses. We're growing tomatoes, we're growing peppers and all, marijuana even. We can adapt. But this idea intuitively to me that we just take these fish farms out of the water and put them onto land-based areas, the economics don't seem to me. It seems to me that very rarely do you find an area where there's enough fresh water. I think in Florida, of all places, there's fish farms, I think salmon or sturgeon fish farms, because the whole under the ground is a huge aquifer. So it's a lot of cheap, easy water to grow fish. But you got to get rid of waste. You know, when you have a hatchery, you can only put so many fish in. Oxygen's an issue. Getting rid of waste. So having a big net, kind of like a drawstring purse, suspended by floats, currents wash away all the deleterious, the ammonia wastes, fish poop, brings in fresh water for oxygenation. So when you have large numbers of fish concentrated in an area, the biological oxygen demand is pretty high.
Yeah, I think that one of the big challenges we're in right now is we don't know what to do, and it feels like people are going to be unable to act if they don't have that context, and it's tough to get that social community, that team together to really explain that to the general public. It seems like the average person doesn't know, and so they get part information, and we just want things to be better for us. And so it's hard for us to kind of understand and be sympathetic to the challenges of other ecosystems going on around us. But you're also making a really good point about climate change. One of the challenges around the recent floods that we had, the atmospheric river, was we immediately blamed it on climate change. And there was an incentive for politicians to blame it on that rather than the level 1 out of level 4 or 5 dike that all of them were not maintained, but of course it's climate change. And as much as there's no disagreement for me that we are changing the climate, it seems like it's become just a tool, just a lip service thing to offset any accountability for how to approach things and improve things. And I'm just interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, I'd just like to tie up the ends, though, on the fish farming. There are ways. You can have offshore, take great big massive, basically oil rig type structures, go offshore where the juveniles aren't migrating, and have your farms out there. Very costly, but the Scandinavians seem to be doing okay on trying that. And then I've got a student in the engineering section of our resource section at BCIT who's doing a capstone study on basically enclosed within the marine environment fish pens, so it doesn't just have straight flow through. So you would condition the water, you basically, I guess, kill, and I'm interested in reading what she has to say, but you kill all the bad bugs that are coming out of the effluent. You're capturing the sewage, essentially the fish poop and nitrates, ammonia, before it gets out. So there are some technologies that might be available to mitigate some of this stuff, but, we're still... It's not going to, doesn't help somebody who was a commercial fisherman who took out a mortgage on his house to buy a bunch of nets for 2022, thinking there was going to be 10 million fish on the Fraser River. Maybe he's bankrupt now. There's a First Nations community somewhere up by Yale that didn't get as many fish as they thought they were because all of a sudden, the dry rack, I think there's a little dry rack fishery, which is really important to certain Fraser Canyon fishing First Nations. But, and actually those early runs did come back stronger but it's early Stewart's much smaller run than the rest of the Fraser. But yeah, you loop out of things like atmospheric rivers in, and the damage it caused. Well, I sat on some of the, I was on the Fraser River floodway committee when I was with Mr. Environment back in the day. So all the diking arrangement, I was looking at it from a fish perspective. Our little group in Chilliwack, the gravel stewardship group, dealt with freight. We actually helped shut down gravel removal for 2 cycles. So they're out there right today as we talk, pulling a bunch of gravel out, because when you get a great big flood, you end up pushing a lot of gravel from the upper part of the watershed into the dikes. We've constrained it. We're all protected here where we're sitting right now by these massive dikes on the Vetter and Vetter Canal. And so these atmospheric rivers and climate change are looping into the decisions that we make here in our development, okay? And you're right, because when I was sitting there back in the 1990s and dike engineers are going, that Sumas River dike, very good. Oh, that Sumas, this goes back 25 years now, that Sumas River, one of these days, and all these things are statistical probabilities. So the hydrologists have these sort of fancy curves where they predict how often a flood of this magnitude will occur. It's a 1 in 100 or 1 in 200 or 1 in 500 year flood. And climate change seems to have been flipping this thing around. But yeah, I'm not going to name names, but certain mayors and their administration should have said, hey, that Sumas dike there, by number 3 road should have been upgraded, and all of a sudden, these farmers are being wiped out. So climate change, I think, in the context of fish and ecosystems, are an easy punching bag, because everybody on the planet is tied to the resolution of that, or everybody on the planet is tied to the increase of climate change. And so it's easy to point to, the other guy, and it's very difficult to say, well, I'm the culprit. I am the culprit, but what are you going to do about it? What am I going to do? Oh, it's too overwhelming for me. I'll buy another 4-wheel drive because I got enough money to do that, okay? Oh, but I'll buy an electric one, notwithstanding the fact that the electricity might have actually been produced by a cogen plant that burns gas or coal or oil or whatever to produce that electricity. Simply because you plug a Tesla into the wall doesn't mean that the electricity that you're putting into your battery wasn't produced by a carbon-based fuel. Europe's, China, these guys don't have these steep, large mountain streams that we have here in British Columbia or in Scandinavia, the central part of Europe. So they're running on nuclear, and they're running on coal, and they're running on gas. Yeah. When I traveled through Western Europe in Western Central Europe in 2017, I was shocked by the number of windmills, shocked by the number of, guys got a little triangle of land between the road and the highway, and there's a whole series of solar panels. I go, wow, that's, and then the anti-solar panel guys go, but look at how much earth you had to rip up to get the elemental materials to build, so it's this argument that goes beyond us. And so I think you have to have it at a mega political level, and certain political trends right now want government to stay away. They're small government, no government interference. I'm some hillbilly in the backwoods of Idaho. I don't want anybody telling me that I can't use a gas guzzler. I don't want anybody to tell me that I got to use a solar panel, And so I really don't know what the answer is. At a smaller level, we in British Columbia can say at a political level, shut down the fish farms, okay? And so part of the Cohen Commission, I put together a presentation, very correlative analysis, and I said, look, these are the relationships. Wherever fish are passing through fish farms, you're getting these collapses. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but this body of evidence. Oh, yeah, Marvin, that's right. Okay, pat you on the head, go away. So in about 2016, I was asked by somebody at the David Suzuki Foundation, John Waring, used to be a biologist there. I want you to give this presentation to the provincial Minister of Fisheries panel on fisheries. Go away. Nobody listens to the... No, we'll pay you. I said, we've got a lot of upgrading to do. We'll pay you. So I got a little bit of money, so it was nice. Put it up. Gave it to a whole room, First Nations, government bureaucrats, scientists, inside and out of academia and government. Oh, that's really, wow, that's interesting. Wow, yeah. Wow, I think you got a point there. Pat you on the head, go away. So I gave it to a few public groups. Oh, that's terrible. That's terrible. Yeah, we got to do something about that. Pat you on the head, go away. And so I've given it to a few members of parliament and a few MLAs and stuff. We got to do something about this. Pat you on the head, go away. So, that's a small issue. Climate change. Now, I saw something the other day that said the ozone layer, you can see the ozone, the hole in the ozone layer, the thickness, however they measure, is actually recovering from, the CFCs or whatever they were called, and all this other stuff. And so we're actually getting some recovery, all the aerosols that we used to spray with the hairspray. And so, at a macro level, we can resolve some of these issues, I think. The other thing is technology. Technology is bad because we use it to destroy things. We use it to create wars. We've got missiles in Ukraine that are dropping on people's heads, but it can also be used for good. But the question is, this is kind of like an arms race. Is technology, is fusion going to come along? We're going to figure it out, so we'll have unlimited cheap, clean, or is fission going to be we're still going to be basically polluting the world with nuclear waste? I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball to be able to say, but I've got friends and relatives. Climate change, just a hoax, and all this kind. In my own world, at relatively short data sets, under 150 years, I can see change. Like in my world of hydrology and things that have changed. So, I have no issues with accepting climate change. When you hear, chunks of Greenland floating off and increasing the ocean levels by, 10 inches or a foot or whatever the number was. And I just read an article yesterday, I think, on some community in Louisiana that had been around since the French, so it was First Nations, French community off of the mouth of Mississippi. I think that, they had this big set of islands or wetlands, farming community, and there's just this tiny little strip left because ocean levels have come up. New Zealand, I spent time on a sabbatical in 2019 in New Zealand, and climate change is a real big deal to these guys because they have so much coastline, and they're seeing their coastline wash away, and they're going like, holy crap, this, we're going to have, so First Nations community down in New Zealand and Maori people and Pacific Islanders, largest Pacific Island community in the South Pacific, not including Maori, because the Maori community is very strongly economically and politically part of the New Zealand community. And some of their, their historic lands are being basically, and it's not every day. It's just that when you get an above average flood or a big storm, all of a sudden that had been dry for, since time immemorial, all of a sudden it has water lapping into it. So, and again, it goes back to, 8 billion people on the planet. If we lost 2 or 3 billion because of a meteor or a nuclear war or whatever, it only sets us back, a generation or so. When you look at the, I think it was 1800s, we had our first billion in the 1800s. So this geometric progression of numbers of people. So, really not sure how that one's going to be grappled with. I'm too much of a small speck on the spectrum of natural resource management and resource education, natural resource education, to come to grips with that one.
Yeah, I guess I come down on a different side. I hope that the expansion, if we're at 8 billion, it means more, and people don't always agree with him, but more Elon Musks, more people who are able to think, what if we were to extract resources on a meteorite or so? Like, that all seems so beyond comprehension, but so did having a phone in your pocket 50 years ago and having it do all the things it does today. I remember, I don't know if you ever saw Spy Kids, but the idea of the watch that they, the thing that they have on their watch, now our watches do far more than even that show could have comprehended. Yeah. And I hope that that is something, and you kind of talked about it, the idea that technology can be a bad, which is nuclear war, but then it can be the potential of good, which is like nuclear energy and fission and these paths that are potentials that we're not there yet. But the hope is that we as a collective, 8 billion of us, can figure out the solution to that. And the challenge we always seem to have is you look at something like World War II, World War I, dark periods in the 20th century, yet a time where a lot of innovation took place. Innovation that you see on smaller scales when you're not being tested, when there isn't an investment in R&D on how to figure out how problems kind of get solved. But I want to ask specifically about gravel in water. Dean talked about, a lot of people talk about how dirty the Fraser looks, and he talks about how a lot of that is a misunderstanding of how that river functions. But there are concerns around the amount of gravel we put in there. I had Carrie Lynn Victor on. She's one of the people near Shiam that was working to restore natural ecosystems to that area, because we just pour in more gravel, then it disintegrates into sand, and then it gets darker and harder to breathe. Can you explain how gravel impacts the Fraser River?
Oh, the Fraser River is a sediment-laden river. Its ecosystem is adapted to being a dirty river, to being a muddy river, and to being a sediment-laden river. Sediment is absolutely critical. The fine sediments and the coarser sediments are absolutely critical to the functioning of that river. People should not be touching gravel. They should not be removing gravel. They should not be. They should be letting the river undergo its normal fluvial processes. By having the river do its own thing, the largest salmon run in British Columbia, single salmon run in British Columbia, is actually between Hope and Mission, and that's the pink salmon run. Back in the late 90s, it was probably around 10 million fish. It's declined precipitously since then, but it's a big gravel-bedded river, mostly from Hope going down to Mission, and then it turns into a sand-bedded river. And so I got to get my numbers straight here, because I work very much on gravel issues and sediment issues, both in the lower river. So I was part of the Dredge Management Advisory Committee, which has been disbanded. It was under the Fraser River Estuary Management Plan, FREMP. And the gravel issues, I was basically the biologist for British Columbia on gravel removal issues. There was this sort of big thing. Oh, we got to get gravel out. The river's flooding. We're going to overtop the dykes. There's vast amounts. There's not vast amounts of gravel. We know that from very detailed assessments. Okay, so I think there's something around 20 million tons of fine sediment that mostly goes. So these are coming off of glaciers in Mount Robson. The Chaco system, the Chilco system, you name it. Some of them have lakes intercepting fine sediments, but a lot of that fine material, about 20 million tons of it, comes down every year. It's more in some years, less in other years, and so that mostly goes out the Strait of Georgia. So there's nutrients and minerals and all sorts of really important stuff that are sort of associated with that sediment pulse. And then there's a smaller amount that basically hops along the bottom. Sometimes it's sediment, so that's coarser sand, up to 2 millimeters. So the numbers 0.011 or 22 millimeters to 2 millimeters. I forget what exact, but anyways, there's that second layer of sediment grouping that mostly doesn't stay in eastern Fraser Valley. Now, that doesn't mean like the top of these islands, out here in East Chilliwack, where the Fraser used to flood in and bring all these rich nutrients and sediments to create that beautiful soil out at Rosedale, Seabird Island, all that rich agricultural land. So the fine stuff, the really finest stuff would deposit, but mostly go out to the Gulf of Georgia, Sailor Sea. The rest of it would, from Mission down to Richmond, essentially, basically, and that was how the delta was formed in the lower part around the Richmond area, this coarser sand, and then the really coarser material, the gravel and cobbles, of which people seem to think there's just an unlimited amount. There's not. The fluvial geomorphic measurements of the change in sediment between Hope and Mission is relatively tiny. So in other words, in terms of changing dike profiles, so the water during flood period is relatively small. We know that from very, very explicit and very detailed modeling exercises, which was done about, I'll say, a little bit more than 15 years ago, but I don't think it's changed much since. Things don't change that much. But pink salmon spawn in the Fraser as a function of every year spring freshet revitalizing that gravel. It kind of moves it around a bit, washes out material, and so that by the end of the summer, there's these big, huge beds of gravel that pink salmon just absolutely love. And so pinks love these more or less unstable gravel habitat features, like the area between Hope and Mission, because every year the Fraser kind of washes it clean, and the bunch of material comes in later on in the early spring, but then the big floods kind of wash it out again. So that really, these dynamic changes, the islands that are eroding away, the new islands that form, the big back channels that Fraser River sturgeon spawn in. Most of the spawning between Mission and Hope by sturgeon. So 1999, I had a company called Limnotech that did a bunch of work and found sturgeon eggs. First time we'd ever found sturgeon eggs, and they were pretty well always in back channels. Main stem, I think the gravel was moving around too much, so that was good for pink salmon, but the big back channels that is more stable, clean gravel, and so the big flood freshets would wash that gravel clean. By the end of the freshet, sturgeon spawn in springtime. The eggs are negatively buoyant. They go to the bottom, they stick. Unlike salmon, who dig their eggs into gravel, sturgeon stick on top. So they need these great big, broad swaths of gravel that are clean, fairly coarse. So, us interfering with the shape and morphology, my personal view, leave it alone. Let the river is powerful enough, stay as far away from it as you can, maintain the vegetations, the big islands like Hurling Island, Carey or Gill Island, Strawberry Island, Minto Island, all of those, we need to draw a red circle around, and we need to more or less stay away from them, let them do their own thing, because the Fraser recreates habitat every year. And when we start putting berms and dikes and riprap banks, it basically disrupts those processes.
You were a part of a documentary called The Heart of the Fraser.
Yeah.
It starts to land on exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that documentary, how it came about, what it's about?
Well, the heart of the Fraser is a term that was coined somewhere, I think, in the late 1990s, and it was to kind of describe this unique. I don't know if there's any other gravel-bedded stream that have salmonids that is not in an estuary. Columbia has a little bit of that, and probably the Skeena, but there's probably parts of the Amur River or some of the big Russian rivers. But for the size of it, this little chunk that's kind of stuck up. It's stuck about 100 kilometers from salt water, and has all this myriad of broken up channels and islands. And so that heart of the Fraser was a term that was created to kind of describe it. The Stalo people maybe have a different term for it. I think Eddie Gardner has another name for it in the Stalo, one of the Stalo languages. And so people started to recognize, hey, this is something different, something unique. This is something pretty special. So downtown Chilliwack used to flood many years before all the dikes went in. So that would have been part of that heart of the Fraser ecosystem. But of course, we've got the big dikes, on out by Island 22, down by Cartmel Road. We've got the big dikes up at Rosedale, and so that those areas that would have Bell Slough and Camp Slough and Hope Slough, all those areas would have been. Hope Slough is probably a big sturgeon spawning habitat. When you look at the cross-sectional morphology of it. It was a big channel. Apparently, First Nations used to use it. You don't have to go up the main channel. You use it as a highway to canoe up and down, so it's a good transportation route. So I kind of understand that. So people started to figure out, hey, this is something special. I don't think they've really figured out how special it is. But a colleague of mine by the name of Mark Angelo started to promote it, and he and I wrote a report for the Pacific Fisheries Resource Conservation Council on the heart of the Fraser, and there was sort of a sister report on the impact of farming community, farming on Eastern Fraser Valley, which is basically much of it is heart of the Fraser, and then over time it got a more and more kind of profile. Media started to take up on it, and then. So Mark was the director of the Fisheries, or of the Rivers Institute at BCIT, and then a colleague by the name of Dr. Ken Ashley became the director, and he was able to get some funding to be able to essentially do a documentary on it. And so I helped the filmmakers. I guess I was sort of on the ground person who told him about this and told him about that. Dean Work was involved in it as well because he's very much a Fraser River person. Grew up in the Eastern Fraser Valley, just out on the Vedder River. So I was East Chilliwack out on Bamford Road. Dean was Vedder River. And so a bunch of people collaborated together to get this documentary together. And I think it's a really good documentary. And it's one of 3 documentaries. There's the Soul of the Fraser, which is the estuary. Heart of the Fraser is our area up here in the Chilliwack, Agassiz mission area. And then there's another documentary that's going to be put together for the Nechako as well. Interesting.
So it's available now, if I'm not mistaken, right? They did their premiere?
The Heart of the Fraser?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's up and running. In fact, anybody who talks to Dr. Ashley at the Rivers Institute can probably get a viewing, and there have been quite a few viewings around. So 2019, when I was down in New Zealand, it was first viewed, and I've given it to my students, I think, once or twice. And
why isn't it more readily available?
You'll have to ask Dr. Ashley about that. We did give it just over here in the high school in Vedder Crossing, so I was involved in that. And I think he has a number of showings around Lower Mainland over the next several months.
Right. Yeah, I just hope that it gets out to everybody so that our city council has access to it. I would like to obviously watch it and learn more and understand in a more meaningful way and make sure that it can be played to my community.
Sure. Yep.
And we do a few hostings to make sure that everybody gets the chance to see it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I'm running for chief of Chihuahua, which is within what you've described as this heart of the Fraser.
Yep.
If I was to succeed, what advice would you have for me on what I can do to make sure that that heart is protected, is understood better? What can an actual person from a First Nations community do if they're a leader to play a role?
Well, there's a few things. I think one is lobby your fellow colleagues at the political level within the Stalo community to have those islands that were sold by Kruger Pulp and Paper. So there was a huge body of islands essentially from Seabird Island down to the lower end of Chilliwack that were basically cut up and sold to private interests. And so they were really sold very cheaply. I think about $10 million for the whole set of islands, maybe a little bit more. And they're undevelopable unless you dike them, really. We lobbied against 2 bridges, one at Carey Island, one at Hurling. A big berm went in at Strawberry. The devastation at Strawberry Island is just should make everybody want to weep, because the Strawberry Island is a phenomenal fish rearing habitat on its surface during spring freshet, and the landowner built, I think without authorization, a big berm out to the island. One or more of the channels was cut off. So I think First Nations community, Stalo community, should hopefully really lobby governments. We're lobbying Joyce Murray as an example, and some of the provincial guys, to purchase these islands and set them aside as a reserve. They need to be set aside as an ecological reserve. 99% of all salmon in the Fraser watershed go through the heart of the Fraser, whether it's upstream as adults or downstream as fry or smolts or whatever. So, or spawn right in that area. Okay, it needs to be protected. There's nothing like it on planet Earth. It's just nothing like it. We also have, I'm working with a group that Watershed Watch, a number of different Stalo community people, STAZA. Maybe you can help me with, it's the environmental group that deals with referrals, are trying to come to grips with restoring some of these destroyed, like Gill Road or Carey Island, that area that was destroyed by mud boggers and, Mad Max road ragers and stuff like that. So that I would say, riparian area, Seabird Island, lobby your friends at Seabird Island to restore a buffer. So Seabird, big agricultural area, but all the riparian area was cut right down to the water's edge. Lobby some of your communities that live within the river. And I know flooding's a really important part of community protection within the Stalo peoples of the heart of the Fraser. But if you can lobby to have some of these edge habitats are so important to maintaining ecosystems within Tuathal, by the river. Make sure that there's a good swath vegetation along. I know, non-First Nation lands. I see, another patch of vegetation cut down right to the river, like in the Laidlaw area. Like, it's just like, for me, it's biologically criminal to see that. Riparian areas, those bands of vegetation along river edges, it helps with ecosystems. It helps to prevent erosion. It helps a whole pile of things. Okay, so those are a couple of things that really come off to the top of my mind. I'd encourage the Stalo community to get education as to how marvelous this ecosystem is. Yeah. I think at Peters Island, there's a bunch of work going on in the wetted floodplain. Like, tell people don't go in that area. Stay away from that area. Restore that area. Educate your youth into what, and quite frankly, there's not a lot of people that work on the heart of the Fraser at a scientific level. I know that because I'm one of the few people that's actually ever had reports written about it, or had students go out and assess, or gone out there with nets and sampling gear, rod and reel, whatever, trying to figure out minnow traps, trying to figure out what's going on there. So I would really encourage the First Nations communities between Mission and Hope to recognize what I think is an extraordinary piece of First Nations ecosystem in all of Canada, and there's tons of stuff from, Nova Scotia to Vancouver Island to, up into the, the northern Mackenzie Delta and stuff like that. But because Fraser River used to have such an extraordinary salmon run, and the heart of the Fraser, those wetlands and islands and channels between Hope and Mission are just so, in my view, so critical to really understand and to protect and lobby and develop legislation within your own political framework to protect these ecosystems.
How do we get educated? Sitting down with you, it's very humbling because it shows me how much I don't know, how much there is to learn about these systems. But how do we give and make sure people have access to the education of sort of what you're describing, but even on a deeper level of exactly what fish, where, how long, when to do this? Yeah. How do we get all of those tools? How do I make sure the youth of my community are able to understand these things at a deeper level than even I have?
Well, I'm faced with that same issue, and I've worked on the heart of the Fraser for 25 or 30 years, going back to my childhood, really. I think the stuff that I've done, and I think I've probably done more than pretty well anybody, sturgeon research, off-channel research, gravel stuff, supervised Dr. Laura Rempel on her assessment of big fish utilization. That's between Mission and Hope's probably the biggest Chinook rearing habitat in all British Columbia. Juvenile Chinook love those great big gravel bars, okay? And so, I feel like I know so little about it.
Yeah.
I think that First Nations community want to find a way to actually understand it, and maybe First Nations community knows a lot about that part of the river that I don't. Traditional ecological knowledge is something that we talk about, I think, at BCIT quite glibly, and I probably worked on First Nations issues from a fisheries perspective more than Nechako. Worked with the ONA. Connected with the Shuswap Nation Tribal Council, the First Nations communities in Catesy, dealt with Kwantlen a bit, and connect. Sometimes I'm on court cases against First Nations. So the Chiam gravel removal case, I was actually against First Nations in the court case around 1990, 91. And then, the next thing you know, I'm working with Cham Band on something, or at least sitting in meetings with them. Yeah. So it's a tough thing because there's all these moving targets, and it's not specific to First Nations. It's the community, British Columbia, Canada, and the world in general, is that things, political sort of viewpoints and understandings and education and values of what something is important, what isn't important. We used to go without any authorization and mine gravel bars. When I was a kid, there was an island, a bar, out by the Catamo. I think we call it Catamo Bar. A log sort area, which is long gone. People don't even know about it. It was mined. It was very stable. It would have been very stable based on aerial photographs. Nobody knew, One of the most exceptional fishing, angling spots in the gravel reach, the Fraser River, and it's gone, right? People just mined it. And so the incremental understanding, education, and knowledge, I think, has to be pushed hard to the political level. City of Chilliwack, the tribal councils, that we need to understand these areas at a scientific level or a traditional ecological knowledge level more than we have, because if we don't, we will have the Strawberry Islands, where a whole macro habitat. I would hate to think how many fish are going to be obliterated production-wise if that island gets turned into a cranberry field. It's just mind-boggling. It's a macro habitat that far and away. So the British Columbia and federal governments have put large money, PSSI, Pacific Salmon sustainability initiative or something like that. Put lots of money into over the last, it's called something a little bit different, BC Shrift or something like that. Prior to that, more habitat lost in Strawberry Island than has been restored, by this funding, this partial billion-dollar, hundreds of $1 million funding entity, and all the work that's been done around British Columbia, like mind-boggling. Yeah. Okay, and so because Stalo and the communities, Chehalis and up, the lower part around Hope, are basically, I'll call them the historical stewards of the landscape. It seems to me that they have special rights, and coming with that special obligations to their subsequent generations. And I'm not in the community. I'm speaking from outside of the community. I have no right to tell a community how they should deal with it, but I'm hopeful that the First Nations communities within the Eastern Fraser Valley would recognize what an extraordinary treasure, what an extraordinary special thing this chunk of river between Hope and Mission represents, going back 10,000 years since the last ice age. And we talk about time immemorial. For me as a biologist, 10,000 years isn't very long. Okay, so 10,000 years is only kind of a sort of a, and I talk about the epochs and the various ages and stuff to my students in class, evolutionary. But having said that, I think First Nations communities have a special right and a special responsibility to something that's so extraordinary, so unique, and so vibrant that I would hope that, people could get together and somehow come up with an arrangement to protect this area.
I agree. That is one of the reasons I wanted to sit down with you, is because your passion, your interest, Dean's interest in the area in which my community is from, puts it on a special radar for me. And I think that it's only through conversations like this we start to understand the problem and start to look at steps on how we can start to improve things. Do you have any advice for people on what organizations they should be a part of? There's so many different ones. There's the Wild Salmon Defenders Alliance. There's just so many different types. Do you have any advice on how people can start to learn and get involved in positive projects to try and support these ecosystems?
I would almost say not. Okay. And the reason for that is I've almost always tried to stay non-aligned. Okay, if say the BC Wildlife Federation comes to me and says, "Can you help us on this?" The Northern Gateway Pipeline, I help them on it. Can you give us a presentation on sturgeon? I'll do that. If Kate C come by and say, "Can you help us?" I'm happy to do that. Watershed Watch, they've asked me to help them. I'll do that. The Alouette River Management Society works in Kate C territory and had been very tied to Kate C and flow issues on the Alouette River, and I help them. Occasionally it's on a contractual basis, mostly pro bono, mostly volunteer. I think you have to find what you're most comfortable in. And the reason I say that is BC Wildlife Federation, as an example, has some extraordinary people that do fabulous things. On the other hand, they sometimes have been considered to be more of a good old boys hunting and fishing group. And look at me, I'm I'll call myself a late middle-aged hunter and fisherman. And I'm at some level, I'm part of that. Okay. There's folks, Watershed Watch, younger, very vibrant folks that are sort of out of my sort of age bracket, more into the folks that I will be educating. But I'm happy to help them as well. And First Nations community, when I was asked, and this was, I was acting as an expert witness, so I was hired by the Stellatan First Nations up in Nechako on sturgeon flows, I was happy to do that. Okay, so I guess and so something like the Salmon River Enhancement Society, I did a lot of work on the Trans-Mountain impacts associated with stream crossings. And when you figure out all the hours of work that you do, I got paid a little bit of money for the contract out of through the intervenor status of that. But still delighted to work with, the folks that were part of that. The executive, Larry, and there's Doug and Annabelle and folks like that, just passionate in their own right. So I think you kind of have to find your own comfort zone with regards to communities, sort of ecosystem groups or fisheries groups or environmental groups.
Don't you think like you've kind of described, we're at a stage where we don't have a lot of time left for people to choose whatever floats their boat?
Yeah.
It seems like you're saying fish farms are really dangerous. If we keep having this decline in salmon, we just won't have any left.
Yeah.
And then we might as well just develop the Fraser to have houses and just forget about the fish in there if we continue down this path. So don't you think maybe having specific ones that are going to fight fish farms or something is a worthwhile investment?
Well, I think groups like Rain Coast. Okay. I think groups like Watershed Watch.
Oh.
I think there's elements of, BC Wildlife Federation is mostly hunting and fishing, but there's elements of it that are really strong environmental. SRES, Salmon River Enhancement Society, really strong. And they go outside of their sort of watershed geographic boundaries. The local group in Maple Ridge, the Alert River Management Society, these are good groups, or they have over time. David Suzuki Foundation, I've worked both little contracts and pro bono for David Suzuki Foundation. Our little gravel stewardship group, which is just some quirky little good old boys in Chilliwack that hated to see an ecosystem that they grew up in fall apart. So those are names that I can put on the table. Sure. That I've had personal familiarity with, and tonight I'll be laying in bed and go, I should have mentioned the Boundary Bay Bird Association, or the Fraser Valley Natural, the Fraser Valley Natural. Dennis Knopf is doing great work. Yeah. So, there'll be tons of groups that'll come flashing in my mind and say, well, okay. But I think you kind of have to do a little bit of research on your own. I like the people in Watershed Watch. Lena Aziz, just wonderful person, and she's just so passionate. She, Indo-Canadian from Dubai, and people say, oh, she was in the heart of the Fraser. Why is she working with First Nations communities here? So, continental India, ethnic, working with local First Nations ethnic and, not European, it's this mixture that is becoming it's kind of like a washing machine, and everybody is tumbling around and trying to find. I think your bearings. You have to have a moral bearing, and by moral, I'm not talking about religious or anything, but your sort of environmental ethos, and then you're going to find your little group that you're comfortable with. I kind of think.
That is brilliant. Marvin, it has been such a pleasure. I've learned so much about how fish migrate, about the importance of ethics in this regard, the challenges that government present us, and the importance of understanding the issues at a deeper level so we don't get kind of convinced that everything is going to be okay and don't worry about anything because we've got economic growth. I think a lot of the issues you face within your field, others have faced. And so I'm glad to be able to hear from voices like yours, like Lee Harding, to see a pattern, to understand how the system sort of works, and hopefully we can start to take steps to address it so that we do have the heart of the Fraser beating in a healthy way in the future. And so it seems like that's your passion, and I'm so grateful to have been able to hear that and experience that today.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed the chat, and I'm sure we will connect in the future.
Absolutely. I really hope so, because you're a wealth of knowledge, and I think it's important that we hear from people like yourself.
Okay. Pleasure to do it.